Okay, so the first question is, what is the significance of the field of biophysics? And the first thing I would say to that, young people, is that, and it would be in response to a question that I hear from young people, is what connection is there between physics and biology? So the first thing we have to understand is that there's no such thing as physics or biology or chemistry or math. In fact, all of these things are parts of science, and science aims to understand the natural world. And the natural world has no respect for our borders, where we imagine that there are separate subjects, physics, chemistry, biology, and so forth. So it's very natural to work on more than one science at once, or work in the areas where the sciences overlap. So for example, biology and physics. Why do we even talk about these different subjects? That has to do with history, and it has to do with professional communities. So in the past, there have been a number of different types of people who try to understand the world in different ways. So for example, there were philosophers, there were theologians, there were people like the alchemists. So the alchemists were interested originally in trying to produce gold from other substances, and then they became interested in transforming different kinds of substances into new substances, and eventually they became interested in understanding that process of how one substance gets transformed into another. Once they became interested in the how and the why, rather than simply trying a number of different ways of making gold and then recording what the result was, that is trial and error. Once they shifted to trying to understand, then it became a science, and that became the science of chemistry. Now, Isaac Newton was someone who was interested in understanding the sky. People in the past were interested in astronomy for various reasons. They ranged from astrology to simply taking care of calendars and things like that. And Isaac Newton was one who showed that he could use mathematics to describe everything that was happening in the movements of the objects in the sky, especially the planets moving around the sun. And he showed, more or less just using mathematics, and very decisively he showed this, that an apple falling to the ground is controlled by the same laws of physics as the laws that are guiding the planets around the sun. And so the group of people who continued with that approach, that is using mathematics to try to predict what's happening in the real world and understand what's happening in the real world, those eventually became the physicists. And then there were other groups of people, for example, they were called naturalists, who were observing nature. They were observing and recording what they saw amongst animals. There were people who were interested in medicine, and the techniques that they used, which involved first observation, they were sort of the forerunners of the modern biology. But when we encounter the problems that are at the forefront of research today, or the practical problems that we have in industry and society, where we're dealing with trying to produce renewable energy, where we're dealing with environmental issues and climate change and things like that. We have to apply whichever methods are most effective at answering the question. And usually it's going to be a combination of those methods. So the chemists traditionally have worked in the laboratory doing controlled experiments. This is the tradition that came out of the alchemy. So their approach tends to start from those that sort of practical work in the lab with what we call a controlled experiment. The controlled experiment means I set everything up, and I decide what the conditions are in my system. I can control everything, which is different from if I go observe in nature. If I go observe in the sky, or if I go out into the field, like an ecologist, for example, then I wouldn't be able to control everything that's around me, but I just observe what's there, and I record it very carefully, and then I try to explain it. So, but biology, and that is a good part of the roots of biology, but modern biology also has incorporated controlled experiments, and modern biology has incorporated the methods of physics. So we have lots of mathematics in biology. We have theoretical chemistry, and much of physical chemistry involves the use of the methods of physics. Physicists today are experimentalists, most of them, the majority. So they are also implementing controlled experiments. They have incorporated the traditional methods of chemistry and biology. So in all of science today, the distinction between physics, chemistry, biology, earth science, mathematics, astronomy, any of these areas is mainly historical, and it's in the way people are trained. It's in the methods and the tools that they emphasize in order to solve scientific problems. So so the person who trains themselves, for example, as a physicist or as a biologist, may have a set of skills that are a little bit different from the person who is trained in another subject. But when they actually go into the real world, especially if they're going into research, and basic research or in technological innovation, where you're doing new things, then you can't tell before you start solving your problem what methods you're going to need. You can't tell whether or not you're going to need to think like a physicist and make a mathematical model, or whether you're going to need to use some of the tools of experimental physics, for example, optical tools like lasers and spectroscopy, or whether you're going to need to use some of the tools of chemistry and biology, some of the laboratory tools. So when you're in the real world, however you've trained, whether you've trained as a physicist or a biologist or anything else, you have to be prepared to work on problems where you're going to have to engage with other areas of science. And that may mean that you're going to have to eventually educate yourself as a biologist, let's say, when you started out as a physicist or as a chemist. Or you're going to have to work with people who have those skills in some kind of collaboration. Now, biophysics is an area, so actually there are a lot of different kinds of biophysics, because biophysics really is wherever people are combining the approaches of physics with the approaches of biology in order to address a problem in real life, which doesn't distinguish between those two. And in fact, this is an expanding area, because you can imagine that with biology and physics and chemistry each being very well-established professions, that the problems that can be addressed just with one of them, just with physics and just with chemistry, have had a lot of attention. But the new problems, the challenging problems, come at the interface between them. So we have a lot of challenging areas in biophysics. On the one hand, there is the understanding the mind, understanding the brain, understanding perception, vision, hearing, and how the brain works. This is an area which is very much at the interface between physics and biology. There's no question, it's a biological question, but the perception and brain function is guided by electrical signals. There's also chemistry involved because there are chemical reactions taking place. And so this is very much an interdisciplinary area. And there are challenging problems for the physicist, for the biologist, for the chemist, but none of these problems are going to allow them to ignore the other area of science. Somehow they would have to, somehow you would have to work and make partnership with people who are able to help you cross between those disciplines. Another area, important area in biophysics, is molecular biophysics, where we're looking at the structure of biological molecules. So biological molecules have very special properties. Many of them are very large molecules compared to the molecules that most chemists and physicists work with day to day. And they have very special properties. There's a very famous essay, and you can find it in the form of a short book by Erwin Schrödinger from the 1940s, before the discovery of DNA, when he was speculating about what the DNA might look like when it's discovered. The name of the essay is What is Life? And he pointed out something at the time that illustrates very well something that's very unique about biology, which is that the molecules that carry out biological functions are large, and unlike most of the molecules that chemists and physicists study, even when the physicist and chemist studies a large molecule, they study molecules that have a simple structure, in that a large molecule is made up of a chain of small molecules linked together that are all the same. But in biology, our large molecules, what we call the macromolecules, are made up of links that are different from each other. So every biological molecule is unique, and this was what enables them to do unique jobs. These biological molecules are nanomachines. They're the size of nanometers or smaller, but they can carry out tasks inside the biological cell that are very highly specialized. And they are very efficient at some of these tasks, much more efficient than anything until now that we've been able to develop with nanotechnology. So there's a lot to learn from them. So this molecular biophysics is interesting from the point of view of biology, because if we can understand the physical properties of these biological molecules, we can explain their biological role in terms of physics and also chemistry, because chemistry is very closely related to this particular area of biophysics. And even further than that, we could get ideas for synthetic biology, where we can produce we can design new molecules, biological molecules, for biological applications or even for other industrial applications. And we can take the lessons that we learn from the biological molecules, that is, we could say from what nature has produced for us, in order to help us to get some ideas for our own designs, our own artificial technology. So these are just two of the very exciting areas in biophysics that combine the physicist's approach and the biologist's approach, and that are very important for the future of biology, and also very exciting from the point of view of physics. So now we come to the other question, which is, how should one prepare for a career in biophysics? And my advice would be, first of all, decide what you like to do, what approach suits you. So, for example, if you study physics, then you're going to, I think you probably realize this, that you're going to need to study a lot of mathematics. So for me, for example, when I started out in biophysics, I actually started out in physics. I did my first degree in physics, and I did a master's degree in physics before I moved into biology. That suited me. Honestly, when I was in school, I found biology and chemistry quite difficult. These are, as we've said, for practical reasons, for historical reasons, they are practical subjects. They require a lot of manual dexterity. They require a lot of attention to detail. You need to work with your hands, and you need to get something to work in the lab. And this was something that I found very challenging, whereas the more theoretical aspects of things, especially mathematical aspects, they suited me. So in terms of the academic study, I enjoyed studying physics more than I enjoyed studying chemistry and biology. But when I went into research, I found that I needed, in order to really address the theoretical problems and the mathematical problems that I was interested in, I would have to bring in some experimental approaches. And some of these experimental approaches would involve instrumentation, which is something that experimental physicists use a lot. So for example, lasers, or spectrometers, the mass spectrometer, the magnetic resonance, and so forth. But also, you need to work with samples. You need to work with your biological samples, with your chemical samples, and this required really going into the lab and doing the controlled experiment. So I had to learn some biology, some biochemistry, and that meant learning at least some practical methods. Now, if you're not very keen on math, for example, and you like to work in the lab, and you enjoy the challenge of trying to get something that gives you a result, that's a physical result that you can put your hands on, then chemistry or molecular biology could be something that you would enjoy more in terms of your academic study. And then if you develop very good skills, practical skills in those areas, then you can probably find somebody who is a physicist or a physical chemist who works with instruments where they have effectively used new kinds of physics in order to be able to probe biological systems in ways that people couldn't do before. And I should say, maybe this is a third area of biophysics, is that in biology, biological systems are very hard to probe in a way that allow us to see what's happening when they're living. And many of the advances that are taking place because of techniques developed by physicists. So physicists, they're using physics. Almost all the experimental methods that are routine now in molecular biology, ultracentrifugation, spectroscopy, electrophoresis, all of them are based on physics, and they were invented by physicists. So this is another area of biophysics where physicists invent techniques to address biological systems. So if you are a biologist and you can do the practical work, you can probably find a physicist or a chemist who is willing to work with you to develop the new method to probe your biological system, or to do the mathematical modeling. If you like the physics and you train yourself as a physicist, and you have this ability to model a system mathematically, or to invent or to design or engineer using physics a new method of getting information about a sample, you could probably find a biologist who has a biological question that they need to answer using these physics techniques. So my advice is, find one of those subjects that suits your skills, suits the kinds of skills that whatever you think you're talented at or that you enjoy, and develop that talent. And then once you've developed those basic skills, then try to learn about the other sciences and seek some collaborations with people who have those complementary skills, the people who are different from you. Whatever it is that you don't have confidence in or that you don't like doing, the people who like those things are your best friends. And those are the people that you want to team up with in your later life. So so this is my suggestion. Find the thing that you enjoy doing, develop those skills, either in physics or in biology or in chemistry, and then from there start to investigate the other scientific fields. So now I would say, when you are an undergraduate student, for example, and you're studying physics, for example, or biology, for example, look in the science magazines. The best ones are Science and Nature, but you may find when you're young, this is a little bit hard for you to read. But I know when I was in high school, for example, there used to be a publication called Science News Weekly. And this had more of a summary of what was happening in the different areas of science. And nowadays, of course, online you can find many of these kinds of publications. So try, while you're studying one subject seriously, to keep up with what's going on in all of the other sciences at this level of the Science News magazine. And this will give you ideas about the way that your subject, your physics or your biology, can be applied in other fields. And when the time comes, then you can branch out into this interdisciplinary type of science.